So at the end of World War II, the rules-based order took shape and was led by the United States, which included several security guarantees that impacted not only Europe, but also Russia. But that begs the question, did these security guarantees from the United States actually protect Russia from Europe? Now, we know some European countries wanted to move straight into Moscow after ousting Hitler, but the US pumped the brakes on that, mostly because we needed to focus on the Pacific theater in Japan. And sure, the United States is allied with the majority of European countries, but the security guarantees the United States provides and the umbrella that protects Europe from war with Russia goes both ways. Russia doesn't have to face a war that it isn't starting itself. Were there not such security guarantees in place, Europe would have militarized long ago in the face of Soviet aggression. But instead, they chose the domestic growth route, understanding that the US had their back, and the US had no interest in war with the Soviet Union. However, they stood firmly enough that we wouldn't tolerate Russia or the Soviet Union invading our allies, a stance that also had the effect of Russia being safe from a European enemy. Now, with the United States pulling back from Europe, does this mean we could see a 21st century sleeping giant emerge on the European continent with a collective European military buildup to kinetically counter Russia? Something similar to what happened in the lead up to World War I. This isn't just some thought experiment. Russia has legitimate reasons to be concerned about the rise of a militarized and independent Europe, especially if the United States steps back from its global security commitments. This transformation would not happen overnight, but if Russia continues its aggressive posture, Europe may have no choice but to rearm at an unprecedented scale. Russian officials, including Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, have warned about the possibility of a militarized Europe turning its sights on Russia. These statements are largely meant to serve as propaganda, portraying Russia as a victim of Western aggression. However, they are not entirely baseless. Russia's worst nightmare is not only a Europe that no longer fears Russian power, but a Europe that might actually attack them. If Europe becomes strong enough to act independently, Russia will lose its ability to intimidate, manipulate, and coerce its neighbors. The very presence of a powerful, self-sufficient European military would force Russia into a defensive posture, preventing it from exerting influence beyond its borders for generations. For decades now, European nations assumed that US security guarantees, along with economic ties and diplomacy with Russia, could contain Russian ambitions. That assumption is now shattered. The invasion of Ukraine exposed Europe's vulnerabilities, pushing countries like Germany, France, Poland, the UK, and the Baltic nations to reconsider their military strategies. With or without US support, they are increasing defense budgets, modernizing their armed forces, and preparing for a future in which they may need to stand against Russia on their own. Europe has the economic and industrial capacity to become a dominant military force. Europe possesses several strategic advantages over Russia across various domains, including economic strength, military personnel, technological capabilities, and logistical infrastructure. The European Union, which doesn't include the UK obviously, has a combined gross domestic product of approximately $17 trillion, which significantly surpasses Russia's GDP of around 1.7 trillion. This substantial economic disparity enables European nations to allocate more resources toward defense and technological advancements without impacting their broader economy. European Union member states plus the UK collectively spend $390 billion on defense, which accounts for 1.6% of their GDP. This is a 30% increase from previous years, and it nearly triples Russia's annual military expenditures, while Europe has much more room to grow. The bottom line is if it wanted to, Europe could outproduce and outarm Russia in the long run. While Russia on paper currently has numerical superiority in ground forces, its equipment is aging, and the war in Ukraine has depleted some of its best military units. Russia is at their weakest point in decades, having drained their military-age male population. Meanwhile, Europe outside of Ukraine is largely unscathed and have nearly 4 times the population of Russia. Plus, Europe far surpasses Russia in technological sophistication. If European nations coordinate their defense industries and strategy, they could create a military force that not only matches but far exceeds Russia in every category except for nuclear weapons. And that is Russia's greatest advantage, their nuclear arsenal. They have long relied on the threat of nuclear retaliation to deter Western intervention. However, this advantage is not absolute. Both France and the United Kingdom possess enough nuclear weapons to destroy most of Russia's population. And if Europe perceives an existential threat from Russia, it could decide to expand its nuclear capabilities rapidly. A future in which Europe collectively develops a nuclear deterrent on par with Russia is not out of the question, particularly if tensions escalate further. While a fully militarized Europe could, in time, have the power to destroy Russia conventionally, that does not mean it would choose to do so. European nations have spent decades embracing diplomacy and economic cooperation over military conflict. However, attitudes are shifting, and there is still the historical reality that the European continent is the site for thousands of years of continuous, brutal wars that, until Ukraine, ended only 80 years ago. And that history is hard to overcome. If Russia expands its aggression beyond Ukraine, or if it engages in actions that cross certain red line thresholds, such as using a nuclear or chemical weapon, in such a scenario, European forces could retaliate militarily, and Russia would find itself facing an opponent far more powerful and coordinated than Ukraine alone. My belief is a world in which the United States reduces its security commitments to Europe would not lead to European weakness, it would lead to European strength. There are already calls for this coming from France and Eastern Europe, a so called collective European force. So while European nations may not seek out war, they will not allow themselves to be vulnerable to Russian aggression. If Russia continues to threaten European stability, it may unintentionally bring about the very thing it fears most: a united, militarized Europe capable of crushing any conventional Russian military threat. Russian leaders should be concerned, not because of America's power or that Europe wants a war with Russia, which is what the Russian media propagandizes while knowing full well that is a lie. They should be concerned because Europe is now realizing that for real, it actually needs to prepare for war. And there are very few alive that remember what Europe looks like when it's on a warpath. Basically, when the continent has a multi millennia long history of warfare and it easily slides right back into that posture. Only this time, the mass of Europe has a collective enemy. The longer Russia continues its aggression, the more it pushes Europe towards militarization. And once that process gains momentum, it may not stop. The balance of power in Europe is shifting, and Russia may one day find itself outmatched by a force it can no longer intimidate. And the US, with all its power and all its influence, may not even care to stop Europe at that point.